And a very good morning to you. I'm Lisa Lord, and thank you for joining for this special media conference, which will focus on matters related to climate change and the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, which is scheduled for later this year. We will be addressed by Prime Minister the Honourable Mia Amor-Motley and our special guest, COP26 President-designate, the Right Honourable Alok Sharma, who has made Barbados one of his stops of a wider Caribbean visit. I will now ask the Right Honourable Alok Sharma to start with a statement.
Well, thank you very much. And could I start by thanking you, Prime Minister, and indeed all your ministers for such a warm welcome. We've had very, very constructive discussions this morning, and we will continue those discussions later on in the day. I'm, of course, delighted with the ambition that you, Prime Minister, are showing and your government is showing when it comes to tackling climate change. And I know that you are working on your revised nationally determined contribution, and I look forward to seeing that emerge. And I also applaud the level of ambition that you have shown with your aim to become a fossil fuel-free island by 2030. And the reality is that such action is absolutely vital. Not only in terms of reducing the emissions, but quite frankly, in terms of the leadership it displays. And it challenges other countries, particularly the biggest emitters, to raise their own ambition and to help keep the goals of the Paris Agreement within reach and keep alive the goal of limiting the average rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. We are making progress towards that goal, although I completely acknowledge that there is much further to go. When the UK took on the COP26 presidency, less than 30% of global GDP was covered by net zero targets. That figure is now 70%. And small island states, or SIDS, have shown some real leadership in tackling the climate crisis. And this, of course, is despite the fact that these are countries that have done the least to cause the effects that we are now feeling around the world. Here, as we have seen and we've discussed with the Prime Minister, the impacts of Hurricane Elsa and the impact that's had on lives and livelihoods. And of course, in my travels as COP President, I have seen firsthand the really quite terrible damage and the impact of the climate crisis on people around the world. And I think it's fair to say that there are very many millions around the world who live in a constant state of concern about the impact on their lives and livelihoods as a result of climate change. And here in Barbados, and of course in countries in this region, you are at the front line of climate change and therefore feel the changes most acutely. During this visit, of course, have also been around the region, and I've heard from people who are affected directly about the increasing frequency of extreme weather events and the fact that they are getting more ferocious in terms of their impact. And that's why I am absolutely determined that COP26 will deliver for the countries most vulnerable to climate change. I recognize the unique vulnerabilities and challenges that small island developing states face, and I will continue to advocate for their priorities. And we must see urgent action to protect the lives and livelihoods of people here. Ahead of COP26, we need the G20 countries to follow the example shown by the small island developing states and the G7 nations and make net zero commitments and ambitious nationally determined contributions. We have less than 4 months to go until COP26, and I look forward to working closely with the Prime Minister and friends here in Barbados towards a successful COP26 that delivers for those who are most vulnerable to climate change and ultimately to safeguard our planet. Thank you.
And thank you very much, sir. I would now like to invite Prime Minister Motley to address us at this time.
Thank you very much. And Minister, let me welcome you formally again and publicly to Barbados. I'm telling you upfront that this will not count as a visit. This will count as an in-transit conversation, and that we look forward to your coming back to us after Glasgow, because we suspect that you may need a little respite thereafter. And we would like to do so in the context of the England-West Indies Test match next year. Having said all of that, I'd like to get on to the business of the moment and to remind us that there really can be no starker reminder of what we are facing and why we're having this press conference today than the fact that it is taking place as the country continues to recover from the impact of Hurricane Elsa less than 1 week ago. The Atlantic weather patterns of recent years leave no doubt that there really has been a significant possibility that Elsa on the 2nd or 3rd of July will not be the last system that most of our islands will face for this hurricane season. And indeed, we will go probably down into November. But while we keep our eyes on the west coast of Africa and see what is coming off of it, we cannot lose focus on some equally challenging climate-related developments. Sea level rise continues. We remain starved for fresh water, and too many of our wells are exhibiting signs of salinity in our aquifers. And our sargassum, regrettably, is inundating our coastlines, making it difficult for some establishments to function that are operating on the coast. On almost every front, our economic livelihood, the quality of life of our people, and the future we want to bequeath to oncoming generations remain under serious threat as we look at this climate crisis. I don't speak about climate change. We speak about a climate crisis because that is what it is for us. And what is demanded at this stage is climate justice. We believe that the inhabitants of small island states like Barbados have to face the reality that while we did not create these burdens, while we remain on the front line, we have to raise our voices to be able to make it clear that we cannot close the gap on our own. And this is not a plea for us to be begging, but it is a reality that the gap that is required, especially on adaptation and not only mitigation, cannot be closed on the basis of our own fiscal efforts alone. To the extent that you are here, I believe that your visit is a genuine recognition that small island developing states are truly on the front line. And I want to thank you for that sensitivity, because it is so easy to talk about us rather than to engage with us. And you have shown that you are seriously interested in how we can manage our way through these difficult times by engaging directly with us and finding the commonalities, not just between developing and developing countries, but between the developing and the developed world. And to the extent that you can help us bridge that as we go into Glasgow, then I believe that we will see greater levels of success going forward. The bottom line is that the industrialized giants of the world have to settle an ambition that makes sense for us to come off of the 1.5. We are already at 1.2 degrees higher than we were. And in so many ways, the notion that we can be at 1.5 in 10 to 12 years is so absolutely frightening that I do not know how the global community has not come together to make the kind of progress that it needs to make to avoid climate refugees, to avoid the specter of failed states, to avoid the irreversible changes to our planet that will inevitably come from the failure to transform our behavior. And I want to say that we accept that while we don't contribute in any major way to the climate crisis, we hold the view that we have also still nonetheless a responsibility to transform our behavior and to transform our policies in order to play our part, however small that part may be on a global level, but however critical that may be in terms of changing the way how we live and what we expect from life with respect to a climate crisis world. Discussions about the crisis, therefore, cannot be treated as esoteric because they are real. Those almost 2,400 persons whose houses have either been damaged or whose roofs have gone less than a week ago know that the crisis is not esoteric. Those who cannot get access to water easily in our systems because our reservoirs are empty or our aquifers are showing salinity, for them the climate crisis is not esoteric. Those who have to fight and ply their trade along beaches that are now reeking of the toxic smells of sargassum know that the crisis is not esoteric. Those, my friends, who have no water nor no light today, 6 days after a hurricane, although in the scheme of things, quite frankly, that is a short period of time for a Category 1 and 2 storm, and in the case of Categories 3 to 5, you can be without utilities for months. They know that the climate crisis is not esoteric. So my friends, when I say to you that Barbados is committed to engaging in a roofs to reefs program, it is because we believe from the protection of our roofs to the protection of our reefs, we have an obligation to sustain our way of life, and we have an obligation to ensure that we are resilient, knowing full well that the weather patterns and the other aspects of the climate crisis will continue to affect us. We believe that there needs to be far greater emphasis on the funding for adaptation than has hitherto taken place. And we believe that as we expand that pool of funding for adaptation while still focusing on mitigation, that the reality of the economic condition of small island developing states and middle-income countries who do not have ready access to in the international capital markets, means that we need to look at, one, gathering the pool of funds, whether in terms of what has been committed with the $100 billion that was agreed to in Paris, but yet to be realized, as well as the revision of that in 2025 that must bring it closer to being able to fix the actual gap that there is, rather than being a drop in the ocean. But we need to start somewhere. Or whether it is through the redistributed SDRs, the new ones and the old ones that are unused, not just the new ones, recognizing that there needs to be that level of blended finance, but more and more, because of the absence of fiscal space in our countries, the need for more grant funds, because loans will only increase our debt to GDP ratio and make it more difficult for us to pursue the sustainable development goals, which are the essence of our development policy as nation states. So it is against that background, therefore, that I ask you to recognize that the opening up of fiscal space and the use of innovative financial instruments, as well as innovative financial clauses like the natural disaster clauses that the Barbados government has put in our debt to be able to deal with the recovery effort from climatic events such as ELSA, that these are not now to be an isolated event, in our view, in the government of Grenada and the government of Barbados's debt arsenal, but ought to be commonplace clauses. And why? Because a borrower and a lender need certainty. And if you don't have the certainty as to how you will treat to the debt after a climatic event, then you are at risk of default. And it would seem to us that there is a greater benefit to providing that certainty through natural disaster clauses that speak specifically to how countries and how lenders will react in the face of an event, rather than leaving it to the serendipity. Against that backdrop, we also believe that the efforts for us to settle on criteria that reflect vulnerability and not just per capita income is critical, because the conditional of being able to access concessional resources is critical, and the cost of capital is critical. Now, the cost of capital, therefore, ought to be as concessional as possible. And the only way that is going to happen is if we start to look at what is the real vulnerability of nation states. And the last comment you made before you handed over to me related to the vulnerability of states. Now, if we accept that the vulnerability of states is germane to what you're doing, then how can it not be germane to the decisions of the international financial institutions as to who they lend to and how much the cost of capital is for lending? Against that background, it is my pleasure today to also share with you that the government of Barbados will be shortly, we've settled our national determined contributions. It is now to be submitted, and I'd like to share with you what we are hoping to do. We have set, of course, the aspirational target of a fossil fuel-free economy by 2030. In these initial NDCs, we recognize that we can get there with a reduction of 70% of what we want. We recognize that we are going to have to work further and in 2025 see whether we can hold to that 2030 target of 100% fossil fuel free, or whether we will have to adjust it thereafter again. But at the very least, we believe that we need to reduce the emissions from 7.7 tons per year per person to 2.3 tons as a recognition of our contribution from this small rock in this global community. We believe that we can have an unconditional commitment to fossil fuel-free electricity sector by 2030. We also believe we can do the same with respect to transport. We believe that we will have to go back and review with respect to other aspects relating to industrial development and agriculture, but I'm confident that within the next 3 years, through both technical assistance as well as our own re-engineering of some of the ways in which we do things, that we will therefore be able to expand that ambition the next time we look at it in 2025. We also feel that the Roofs to Reefs program, which is a flagship program for our country, as I said earlier, is absolutely an essential part of how we need to go forward in terms of reinforcing our roofs, and protecting our reefs, while at the same time taking care of anything that flows from that top of the roofs to the bottom of the ocean floor with the reefs. And there are many things relating to agricultural runoff, relating to how we deal with sewage, relating to how we deal with a whole host of other things, including strengthening our building stock significantly. We also feel that there should be a deliberate focus on using distributed generation to provide modern energy access and to build resilience for low-income households in our country. And the efforts for that have been reinforced by our desire as a government to have a revolution, a silent revolution in housing, and using the photovoltaic panels not only for the very, very good purpose of being able to reduce our emissions, but equally as a tool of empowerment to make affordable for households the ownership of housing, as opposed to keeping them as tenants in their own land, because of the revenue stream that will come from the photovoltaic panels on the individual rooftops of houses in this country, from very low income right up to mansions. We also want to commit to, as I said, to reduce 20% reduction relative to business as usual emissions in 2025 without international support, and that is an unconditional commitment. A 35% reduction relative to business as usual emissions in 2025, and that is conditional upon international support. A 35% reduction relative to business as usual emissions in 2030 without international support, that is unconditional. And a 70% reduction relative to business as usual emissions in 2030, that is conditional upon international support. I've used this opportunity to share not only with the country but with the entire world what Barbados is prepared to do. As we say always, we have to be prepared not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. We hope, however, that the global community, and we start first now with the G20 countries, will recognize that this is not a battle that any of us can win singularly, but it requires the global commitment, and that includes the large G20 countries whose actions will actually have a significant impact on the reduction of the greenhouse gases that we want to see globally. We have traditionally, Minister, spoken about small island developing states. It is with great regret that in 2021 we have changed our language from small island developing states being on the front line to those countries between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. And we've done it not because we believe that we have a loud voice to bring large numbers with us. We've done it because, regrettably, speaking as small island developing states, we've had little or no impact on the trajectory of the world's activity towards the 1.5 degrees. We have said in a very, very, very catchy way, 1.5 to survive. We didn't say 1.5 to thrive. We said 1.5 to survive. It is incomprehensible, therefore, that the world continues to be deaf to our calls, and too much of the world. But that if Glasgow can be that moment when the world finally sees those states that are on the front line and is prepared to do more than speak in notional terms to the justice of the moment or to the aspirations of the moment, but is prepared to put in a tangible way the resources to help us fight the battle of adaptation and mitigation, of sustaining our societies in a sustainable way. If we can achieve that at Glasgow, then I believe that all of our children and grandchildren will have a new lease on a global community and in a world that can be there for them in a way that it was for us. That is the true test and challenge to our leadership across the global community as we go into Glasgow. And I have every confidence that while the efforts, or while it is challenging and it is going to be difficult, I have every confidence that we shall in fact get there. There may be some difficult moments, as I said, but I do believe that human beings fundamentally want to live. The question is whether we've made the case sufficiently for those who don't yet accept that the greatest threat to our ability to live is the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Now, several members of the media are joining us virtually. I will ask members to identify themselves and the media house they represent before posing their questions. The floor is open.
Hi, good morning, Madam Prime Minister and President. I have just one question for you, Prime Minister. You would have mentioned the renewable energy goals by 2030, and in your presentation, you would have hinted at the possibility of a review of some of those goals by 2025. Could you tell me if the exogenous shocks of, let's say, COVID-19 and other events would have set back Barbados' goal for 100% renewable energy by 2030?
Absolutely no doubt that all of the various exogenous shocks have left us more beleaguered economically and financially than we would have liked. But that does not mean that we are going to allow them to keep us down. The reality is we are making a case for access to blended resources, more grant resources, as I've said, and more concessional resources, recognizing that vulnerability ought to be one of the serious criteria used, if not a multidimensional vulnerability index, to help us access the money that we need to build the defenses to be resilient against these increased storms, increased droughts, increased coral bleaching. All of these things come and cost money. And therefore, if we have less money to spend because we are spending it on rebuilding houses, or we're spending it, as we are doing this year, on a significant expansion of access to water, augmentation of water resources, or cleaning up sargassum, or cleaning up ash, then of course we have less money to put forward to do the restoring or the re-engineering of more of our housing stock in order to ensure that the next time an Elsa comes or a Janet comes, that we will be able to withstand those kinds of hurricanes. Or the next time that we have a serious drought, we have strategic water resources that are affordable and accessible to every household and to every business.
Are there any further questions?
Yes, one more question from me, Madam Prime Minister. With regards to ELSA, which just affected us last week, we have a fair amount of renewable energy infrastructure. Do you have an idea of the damage that sustained, if any? And also, were there any lessons learned in terms of how we go about constructing that renewable energy infrastructure that would foster resilience in the long term?
I'm waiting, Colville, on reports today at Cabinet, hopefully, and if not today, by tomorrow for sure, of the agricultural sector and the renewable energy sector. The reports that we have in the first few days were those that were easily to get. For example, house damage, poles down, transformers down, etc. But the audit with respect to both the agricultural sector and the other infrastructure, including renewable energy, has now to be submitted to us. So it's a little too early for us to prejudge whether the engineering solutions that have put them there are sufficient to keep them there.
Good morning, Sherita Griffith from CBC. This question is for Prime Minister Motley. You would have mentioned several things that we're aiming to reduce. I heard you mention 7.7 tons down to 2.3 tons, and then also some significant targets as it relates to business. How are you proposing to go about achieving this change, and how much do you think it will require a change in the way Barbadians now live?
I think that we have to recognize that the world in which we live is different. As I said, we want to move from 7.7 tons per year per person to 2.3. The global average now is 8.8 tons per person per year. So we're already below the global average, but we believe that we can come down even further. We don't generate electricity from coal or anything so, but we use fossil fuels. So what are we going to do? This is a country that is not unfamiliar with solar. In fact, if you said solar for the last 50 years, Minister, you would be referring to solar water heaters, because Barbados has been a global leader in terms of the penetration of solar water heating in this country. We want people now to move to the next level, which is the photovoltaic panels. And that's going to mean individual investments by house owners who already are in a position, and for us to find the appropriate financing instruments so that persons can get there as well. It's going to mean, however, because photovoltaic panels is land hungry, and therefore we're going to have a combined policy with agriculture to ensure that we don't preclude food security as a national objective while securing a fossil fuel free environment. So we're going to have to learn to practice agriculture differently from what we do. I think you've seen examples of it with black belly sheep under the panels, and you've seen some instances where, but that requires a higher height if you're going to do crops. And that is where Colville's question as to the engineering capacity to secure that, because higher height means a wider grid in order to secure the panels. We're going to have to learn to be far more adept at water conservation. And we have to be able to ensure that we can also take decisions that will help us protect our marine environment. Minister Humphrey will be doing more to be speaking to the country about the marine protection areas that are absolutely critical. And those relate to not just the damage to reefs from acidification or the warming of the seas, but it's also the damage to reefs by our own fishing practices. So where you have people using the seine nets and pulling them over the reefs and destroying the reefs, the impact of that will also be to allow for greater coastal erosion and narrower beaches. We make our living from tourism. Tourism has beaches as one of its essential components of what we offer to the world. So I just give you a few of these things to show you that while we talk up here about government policy, it is only going to be transformative if it comes down to here into individual behavioral change. And what I want to see is, I tell everybody, every young person that I meet, especially those who are from here in the Caribbean, that any young person under the age of 30 in the Caribbean ought to be the soldiers in the war against climate crisis. And regrettably, I'm not sure that the level of awareness is as high as I would like among the ordinary citizens of the region. And I think that we have a lot of work to do in terms of public education and sensitization with respect to that. It's growing, but it is not yet where it needs to be.
And there's time for just one more question.
Hi, good morning. Crystal Boyne, Barbados Advocate. My question is for the Prime Minister. Recently, I did an interview and I spoke to some of the persons in the agricultural sector, and being that I'm here, we're talking about climate change. I think this is something that is relevant. One of the concerns was the issue of power and having that access to power, especially during things like storms and so on. One of the main concerns right now in that sector is the dairy farmers and having that alternate in energy. There was a lack of generators and so on. So I'm wondering, from a government standpoint, are there any plans in place to really facilitate and help that particular sector? I know some of the farmers do say that they are, it's difficult to get funding and so on. So my question really is, what plans are in place immediately to help persons? Because we are in the season. Is there anything immediately happening that might help that particular sector?
Well, I think there are two issues here. The first issue, as it relates to how do we sustain agricultural production in an economy, in a country that is fighting the climate crisis. You need water for good farming. That's the first thing. Water has to be accessible and affordable. And therefore, the actions that we take to augment water are absolutely critical. Secondly, you need to recognize that the revenue that flows from renewable energy can be that companion that the agricultural sector has been looking for the longest time to make them more competitive and more profitable. And I trust and pray that we are going to see, therefore, more farmers participate in the renewable energy sector, as we've been discussing, certainly with those within the sugar industry and those within some of the livestock farming practitioners that we have on island. But at the same time, I'm hearing you, because the truth is that there also needs to be a question of how we treat to the issue of insurance, especially with these excessive climatic events, and how do we deal with what is beyond our control, which is the impact of the climatic event to destroy the crop or the livestock. And we saw it in Guyana recently and Suriname. It's not just about hurricanes. They've had the worst floods that they've had in decades. And they're outside of the hurricane belt. And who has been affected primarily in those rural areas in Guyana? It's the farmers. So this is a real issue that we're going to have to continue to contend with, and it is multidimensional in terms of access to funding, access to insurance, access to technology, all of the different things that will make a fundamental difference to them being able to survive and to be profitable. In the short term, clearly, we're going to have to, as I said, when we get the audit from Hurricane Elsa, see how we can assist. But the real long-term benefits will come from changing their relationship to the investment by including the renewable energy, which helps us also at the national level. And I don't want people to believe that the only aspect of renewable energy for us is going to be solar. We are pursuing wind, both onshore, but predominantly we hope offshore. We are also pursuing biofuels, and we are hoping that we will have a green energy park very shortly that will allow us also to solve our solid waste problem, as well as to ensure that there's a dedicated source of revenue for us to manage solid waste through partnering with the private sector in the green energy park. So these things are multidimensional, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take new ways of doing business and new financial instruments that have not hitherto been part and parcel of our experience.
And Prime Minister, if I may, I would just like to ask if you or Mr. Sharma have any closing comments at this time?
Well, I'd like to ask Mr. Sharma to tell the country and to tell us what you expect of us, because you have been given the world's most important job. And I mean that sincerely. And on your shoulders, therefore, rests a very heavy burden. And I feel that our people would want to hear from you what you expect of us in terms of playing our role to make your job successful. Thank you.
Well, Prime Minister, thank you very much. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think the overarching ambition that we have for COP26 is that the world believes and recognises that coming out of Glasgow, we have done enough as world leaders to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. As you said, Prime Minister, this is a question of 1.5 to survive for very many people across the world. And of course, as part of that, we are asking countries to come forward with emission reduction targets which are ambitious, targets which show that they're going to go to net zero by the middle of the century. And I want to thank you for the NDC that you yourself have just outlined. It's ambitious, and that's a level of ambition that we want to see from the biggest emitters. You spoke about the G20, and I think there's an opportunity for us to work together as part of the messaging in a coordinated way to ask all countries, particularly the biggest emitters, to come forward with ambition without them stepping up to the plate in the same way that you and many other small island developing states, the front line of climate change, have done. I'm afraid keeping the 1.5 alive is going to be increasingly challenging. You mentioned finance, Prime Minister, and let me say to you that I'm totally committed to ensuring that the developed countries that have promised $100 billion a year are actually going to deliver that, and I hope we will be able to, on the road to and at COP itself, set out a delivery plan on that, which I want to hold the developed nations to. And this, for me, is very much a matter of trust. It's a totemic figure, and we absolutely have to deliver it. You've spoken, of course, and I think that's an area where we can also continue to work together and ensure that we are making the case to the donor countries. You spoke about your clean energy transition. I applaud that. It is something that I see around the world, this move to a clean energy transition. And again, where there is opportunity for us to work together to ensure that private sector funding is also coming into Barbados to support those aims. I'm very happy on a bilateral basis to see how we might be able to do that. And finally, as you know, there are a number of issues from the Paris rulebook that are still outstanding. We want to work with you. We want to ensure that we give full life to the historic Paris Agreement. We want to see that coming out of COP. The final thing I want to say is that I think this is an opportunity. COVID has posed the most extreme challenge to countries around the world, and quite rightly, all countries have done the best they can to support their own citizens. But I think this is an opportunity now, coming out of COVID, for us to reimagine our economies, as you are going to be doing through your NDC, and see how we can build back better, build forward better, I think is the way that you refer to it as. And the final thing I say is that time is indeed very, very short. We have a report from the IPCC, which will emerge next month, which I suspect will show that we are in a stark position. And I just want to leave everyone with this one particular message, is that the next decade, the next 9.5 years, are going to be absolutely decisive. And for a child born today, their future, in terms of the future of our planet when it comes to climate, will be set before that child has completed its primary education. It is as stark as that, and as you said, Prime Minister, we owe this not just to our generation, but of course to future generations to get this right. We cannot afford to fail on the road to COP26, and I look forward to your close working relationship and collaboration as we work together to achieve success, which ultimately will belong to all of us if we do indeed achieve success at COP. Thank you.
Prime Minister?
Thank you very much. We will play our role. We will make the hard decisions. We will work with our populations to change our relationship to the ocean, to our housing and our building mechanisms. We will even start to have discussions with persons as to what else is contributing to greenhouse gases. And we know that industrial livestock, industrial scale livestock and other things also have a deleterious impact on the emissions. And it is to that extent, therefore, that I think that beyond the macro arguments of vulnerability, of access to financing, of redistribution, of the NDCs, the real battle now has to be at the level of moving more bodies in our population globally, a people's movement globally, to be able to ensure that those in government are taking the decisions that are necessary in the next decade. You have said it better than I can say it, that a child born now will face a world that is going to be cast in stone by the actions of the next decade or less. And to that extent, if ever there was an obligation on all of us to stand up and play our part, it is now. Barbados will play its part, and we will work to ensure that each of our citizens recognizes the importance of playing its part for the survival, not just of this country, but of the world in which we live. Thank you.
And as we close, let me thank Prime Minister, the Honourable Mia Amor-Motley, and special guest, COP26 President-designate, the Right Honourable Alok Sharma, for addressing us. Members of the media, thank you for your questions, and you for joining. Good morning.